My name is Josh and I'm currently 20 as I'm writing this. This happened almost 4 months ago when I moved out of state to start my first semester of college. My financial aid would not cover housing, so I found myself scrambling to find off-campus housing. Fortunately, with the help of my parents, I was able to rent out a house for 2 semesters. It was this small one-story home that was just a hop, skip, and a jump from campus. It wasn't the nicest house, but it was what I could afford at the time. The majority of people in the surrounding homes were a lot older than me, though. That was expected when living off campus. However, there was this one guy who lived a couple houses down that gave off a really weird vibe. If I had to guess, I'd say he had to be in his late 50 seconds or early 60 seconds. He would go on long walks with his dog really early in the morning and knock on my door to say good morning. At first it wasn't that strange, but he began doing this every day, which made me a bit irritated. On top of this, he would always try to strike up these long, unnecessary conversations that I wasn't interested in. If I ever made up an excuse as to why I couldn't talk to him, he'd disregard my words and do it anyway. It even came to a point where I told him I was late for class, and he had walked with me to campus. The only time he'd ever leave is if I went into class or in one of the buildings. No matter how many times I tried getting him to go away, he still persisted. I'd give him a dry response, he'd only talk more. I'd walk faster, he'd walk faster. This went on for a good 2 weeks before I finally told him in the most polite way to leave me alone in the mornings as I had school. He seemed to have understood, but also gave me this look of pure disappointment. I felt bad, but I legitimately couldn't have him doing what he's been doing anymore. I remember one of the other neighbors telling me he apparently suffered from some personality disorder, but that he didn't have a history of violence or anything. I asked why he seemed to only be acting like this towards me, and he told me that it wasn't his place to decide who lived there, as that decision was up to the property manager. Weeks went by and I hadn't seen him at my door, nor did I see him come out of his house with his dog. I thought of this as suspicious, but dismissed it as him respecting my wishes by leaving me alone. Those weeks were normal, with me focusing on my studies, being social with friends, etc. Life went on as usual after that, until one night where something happened. I didn't expect. I was in my room studying for one of my midterms, when I hear something small hit my window. The curtains were covered, so I wasn't able to see what it was. About 10 seconds later, I hear it again, and then came to the conclusion that it was a small rock hitting my window. This time I got up and opened my curtains to see the man standing still as a statue outside. As if that wasn't strange enough by itself, he wasn't even on the sidewalk, but rather on the driveway of the house. By this point it was decently late and decided to call it a night. I simply ignored him by closing my curtains. Even though I was terrified inside, I shut off all the lights, making sure to lock every door and window in the house to ensure he didn't come in the next morning. I carefully unlocked the front door to check if he was still out there. When the coast was clear, I booked it toward campus, where I was constantly looking back to make sure I wasn't being followed. I went to my classes, hung out with some of my friends, and by the time evening hit, I walked back home and was met with a sight I wasn't expecting. There were about 3, maybe 4 police cars, along with an ambulance parked outside my house, their lights flashing over the sound of radio chatter. I saw paramedics putting a man I had never seen before on a stretcher and into the ambulance. I then saw police handcuffing my creepy neighbor and putting him into a police cruiser. When I basically demanded to know what was going on, they told me that the person harmed was actually the meter reader. I completely forgot about this, as I've only ever met the meter reader once, and that was when I moved in. By law, a meter reader can typically enter a home whether you're there to let them in or not. He had keys to my house and entered through the back door to check the meters in the basement, waiting for him in. The basement was my neighbor, who jumped him with one of my kitchen knives and jammed it into his shoulder. The reason he was in my house was to probably wait for me until I got home. He must have mistaken the meter reader for me. And that's when he attacked. To my surprise, someone in the area had spotted the man entering the house through a window before the reader got there and called the police. A couple days later, I was moved to a different location off campus and was actually reimbursed for my family paid. I'm graduating in a couple years, and while I'm definitely going to miss college, I sure hope I don't ever encounter something like that again. About 2 years ago, I bought a house for the first time ever, at only 28 years old. It was my first ever real investment, you can say, and I couldn't be prouder of myself. I worked in the entertainment industry for big celebrities, social media influencers and stuff like that, so I made decent money. Most of my neighbors were nice, some had. Kids some didn't. And sort of just kept to themselves. It was just me and my dog Milo. Milo was a pure white Dogo Argentino, with the height of a small horse and a bite so powerful it could tear a limb off. All I have to say is, good luck breaking into my house with him. Around my first week of moving in, I met one of my neighbors who gave me the all-too-familiar greeting followed by a batch of sugar cookies, the usual welcoming you would commonly see when someone moves into a new neighborhood. Introduced herself as Brenda, and told me she had lived just up the street, and that it was nice to meet me. She was the sweet little old lady who had the heart of gold and was a joy to anyone. Brenda had went on to explain that her cookies were homemade and that it was her very own recipe. Surprisingly enough, I was actually allergic to wheat flour, but I wasn't going to be rude and declined them. I just put them on the kitchen counter, wondering if I should throw them away or give them to someone in need. By this point, I had successfully moved everything in and decided to call some of my childhood friends over to come and celebrate with some beer. It was already 9, and I had to get to bed early for work the next morning, so I knew my friends couldn't stay long when they arrived. We had seen a football game on TV, had some dinner, and just enjoyed ourselves. At one point, we're all talking amongst ourselves, having a blast with beers in our hands. When I see Milo stare at me in this weird position, I playfully asked him what was up, and he responded with faint whimpers as he laid back down. It was then when I immediately knew something was wrong. I had Milo for almost 5 years now, and not once did I ever see him behave like this. Now, I'm obviously no expert or anything, but it was almost as if his attitude kept changing every few minutes. One minute he'd be happy, the next he'd be sad, and the next minute just flat out angry. His demeanor completely altered. One of my friends had a girlfriend who was a vet, and he was able to FaceTime her, where I was able to tell her what was going on. She immediately started asking if I fed him something he shouldn't have eaten or if he were on medication. I was about to say no when I remembered about the cookies I had left on the table. Sure enough, I found a chewed up plastic plate along with half a dozen of those cookies devoured, scattered across the hallway. Milo must have helped himself to my special treat when I wasn't looking, and I guess I didn't notice until now. 2 of my friends had to leave, while the other one had decided to help me rush Milo to the vet. Turns out he was just on the verge of death when we got there. As the vet explained, he was displaying unusual symptoms. They ran a few tests on him, and what they found shocked them to their core. High traces of boredom were found in Milo's system. It's a seriously dangerous poison used for killing larger rodents like possums and other pests. When ingested or consumed by humans, it causes your body to shut down your organs to the point where your body doesn't even know how to fight it off. It starts off mild but gradually develops over a few hours. We later found out that it had been embedded inside of the cookies. Law enforcement had taken down my information about the woman who gave me those cookies, and after a whole search of the neighborhood, she was never found. To be completely honest with you, even sure if she even lived in the neighborhood, why she targeted me and why she laced the cookies with rodent poison is still unclear. Milo thankfully ended up living and is still the happiest companion I know. My wife and I got married and just had our first kid, who absolutely adores Milo. I'll protect them all with my life. My 2 kids, Josh and Matthew, were twins. One is 6, the other is 7. We all lived in Ohio for most of our lives, in the same city, same town, and same neighborhood. We loved our neighborhood like never before. The people were nice, school wasn't too far, and it had a nice playground. For the kids, however, something happened about a year ago that changed our whole perspective on this neighborhood. It was the middle of summer, maybe mid-June, and our next-door neighbor had sold the house. Not even a month later, someone immediately moved in, and right off the bat, he didn't seem like a people person. He mainly kept to himself and barely came out of the house. Only time we'd really see him was when he went to work or sat down on his lawn chair, which was rare. While all of this was a bit odd, we didn't pay much attention to it, as it's not our problem. One day I was getting the kids ready for school, and as soon as we stepped outside, we saw our neighbor right by our driveway. He gave us a nod, and I sort of gave him a smile to be polite. Believe me when I say he literally watched us as I put my kids in the car as we drove off. As a matter of fact, he more so stared at my kids rather than me, and I definitely saw that they were uncomfortable. This unfortunately started to become a routine for about a good month, before my wife and I had a Problem with it, my wife made me go knock on his door to basically tell him that we didn't appreciate him looking at my kids the way he did. I remember him giving a really dry response by half-assing an apology. Nonetheless, I still thanked him, and that if he did it again I'd have to call the police after that. He sort of slammed the door in my face, but I just hope he got the message, as he definitely was not in his right mind. Weeks went by, and I noticed he hadn't come out of his house to do his little creepy routine or whatever. I'll admit it made us a lot more comfortable knowing that we didn't have to worry about it anymore. However, just a few days later that all changed. It was around 2 a.m. on a Thursday, and my wife and I were watching a movie downstairs when we hear both our kids calling us. We both run up to their room. When Matthew says that he saw that of a flash from outside, it was storming out, so I assumed it was lightning. However, both my kids knew what was lightning and what wasn't. Matthew then claimed that he had saw the same man staring outside, holding something in his hands. My wife and I put 2 and 2 together, and I ran out of the house knocking on his door like a madman. It took a few minutes before he came outside, clearly pretending had woken him up. I asked him to show me the camera he had, and that I was calling the police. He tried to make it seem like he was innocent, and that he didn't have a camera, but I wasn't buying it. My wife and I called 911, and police were able to step inside his house, and sure enough found a camera. They wouldn't tell us, but whatever they found on it was enough for them to make an arrest. The only thing they showed us was that he indeed snapped a photo of my children. His bedroom, if I'm not mistaken. He was put in jail for a while, and we ended up moving out of state just a month later. A little bit of context as to what made this story absolutely horrifying. A few years ago I owned a farm in northern Maine for about 2 years before selling it to a rancher. The farm wasn't anything too crazy. It was just a simple barn house and a small cabin. While it may not have been the nicest farm, the view it had was amazing: rolling hills, grasslands, and just the overall country of the state. I owned the farm itself, but I never made the effort to actually live there, as it's too much money to maintain, and I just wasn't ready for it. Most farmers dream of the idea to live on their farm, but they often fail to realize how expensive it really is. That said, I still went up to my farm pretty often to watch over my livestock and help maintain it the best I can. Sometimes I paid my buddy Frank to do it for me, but that wasn't always the case. One day Frank had felt sick and couldn't make it that day. This was during the peak of the pandemic, so I sort of understood this meant that I had to go over to do it myself, which I didn't mind, but it was very demanding, and I had to get stuff done anyway. I drive about a good 45 minutes to my farm and instantly noticed the barn door had been left slightly open. This obviously angered me, as I always tell Frank to remember to lock the doors. I sigh and get out of my car and walk over to the barn house, and as I'm open the door, I get a weird feeling looking back. I wasn't sure why I had this feeling, but something inside me told me not to open the door. I tried to erase these feelings as me just being paranoid, but the more I did, the worse the feeling became, assuming that it was probably Frank being a dumbass and forgetting to lock the barn. I call him up, confronting him about it. However, after explaining myself, he didn't know what I was talking about and said that he did lock it. That's when I turn over to the barn doors and see that the latch to lock the doors had been broken, as in cut, tampered with, which made the latch fall to the ground. Needless to say, I apologized to Frank and told him that there could have been someone in the barn. At this point, I'm still on the phone with Frank, and he tells me that I should go inside the cabin to check the cameras before inspecting the barn. Most of the time, I don't really take advice from anyone, but for some reason I to listen. The barn has several cameras installed, 2 on the outside and 1 on the inside. Anyway, I opened my laptop to check the cameras, and what I saw absolutely shook me. Inside of the barn was someone standing there next to the main doors, presumably waiting for me to go inside. Whoever this was probably heard my car approaching and hid inside the barn. The camera quality wasn't the best, but I could see that they appeared to have something in their hands based on their movements. They tried to act stealthy in an attempt to not make any noise. Thank God I didn't end up walking in, and thank God for Frank. I tell Frank everything and told him that I was going to call the sheriff. Thankfully, the sheriff's office isn't too far, so I knew they wouldn't be long. As a request, I asked for them to turn off their sirens to not scare whoever was in my barn. Thankfully, they get here in a matter of minutes and arrest the person who turned out to be my neighbor's son. Somehow he had found out that Frank wasn't here today and took that chance to do God knows what. Police searched him, but had found nothing that was stolen. I remember his parents begging me not to press charges, but I didn't even bother listening. The scariest part about this is what his intentions were. Had I not called Frank to tell him about the lock, things probably would have turned out differently for me. Had I been so dumb, I don't know, and I'm not sure I